I've spoken to about 180 different organizations. 12% of organizations said we haven't even started, but the vast majority, 88%, had at least started. Definitely a lot of heavy experimentation.
A lot of people still plug agent behind a chatbot and call it agentic as well.
3,000 startups in stealth mode right now that I have been pitched. Every single one of these guys all comes down to, oh, we'll just do some sort of anomalous behavior analysis, which is complete failure right from the start.
You want to give a non-deterministic model with a non-human identity right access to our product system.
Right.
I don't know how many MCPs are running at any given point in time in my organization.
If the agent makes the wrong mistake. It's just really too early to know all the different ways agents can operate. You're going to need a remediation layer. Again, the assume breach mentality. The concern I have is these agents are getting built all over the place. How do I actually have active, real-time enforcement of guardrails that I want? And what do I do if something goes wrong?
If you have been trying to unpack why is it that AI is not being able to made into production, well, possible one reason is the fact that people cannot rewind, and I say that in no pun intended, the changes that are made by LLM. And obviously there's a lot more to this conversation. So fortunately, I had a chance to speak to Dev Rishi, who is Predibase, which was acquired by Rubrik. And we spoke about some of the reasons why there are concerns about trust, what kind of organizations are actually going into production with Gen AI, what was the difference between deep learning and Gen AI use cases. Why is it that it's a problem today that we cannot stop a AI bot or AI agent be able to just go away, drift away from what we are putting as a policy, and how to solve that as well. All that and more in this conversation with Dev, myself, and Caleb. If you know someone who's trying to unpack how they can go into production with AI, and what are some of the challenges they would come across, and some of the things they could do from a work procedure and paper perspective, and what could be slowing them down, definitely share this with them. And if you are here for a second or third time and have been enjoying episodes of AI Security Podcast, I would really appreciate if you take a quick second to drop that follow or subscribe button, whichever platform you're listening or watching this on, whether it's Apple, Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube, we're everywhere. Really appreciate you taking that second. It helps us grow and get more amazing guests as well. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I'll talk to you soon. Hello and welcome to another episode of AI Security Podcast. We've got a guest here, Dev Rishi. Hey man, thanks for coming on the show.
Of course, yeah, thanks for having me.
Maybe to kick things off, if you can share a bit about yourself, who you are, and what you've been up to.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Dave Rishi. My official title, I think, is a GM of AI at Rubrik. Prior to this, I was co-founder and CEO of my own generative AI infrastructure startup called Predibase. We helped organizations really tune models for high accuracy, lower cost and efficiency, and deploy them in largely for high volume use cases. So a large number of both leading Silicon Valley tech companies as well as enterprise customers. And we joined forces with Rubrik this summer. Really excited to be leading a lot of our AI initiatives here.
When you say building, so is this like a non-foundational model LLM?
It's a good question. So we actually started the company in 2021, which was about a year and a half before the ChatGPT wave. And we started with the previous generation of models, which were deep learning models, still transformer-based architectures in most cases. But the most popular use case in 2021, 2022 of our platform was fine-tuning and deploying a 300 million parameter model. Now, what ended up changing was really the same types of primitives, but scaling that up 1, 2, or 3 orders of magnitude. And so it shifted from deep learning models to being pretty heavily involved with foundation models and small language models.
So it was fairly common, obviously, before sort of the generative AI big foundational models for, I think, these corporations and enterprises to take these smaller, unique use cases, fine-tune neural networks or machine learning models to do this. Ever since the sort of, OpenAIs, Anthropics, and Geminis of the world have come out, do you see, what do you see as the trend in enterprises? And I'm just going to sort of take a stab, but I'd love to hear have you seen a lot of these guys abandon some of these models, moving more towards the large language models? Do you see even enterprises thinking about fine-tuning these models themselves, like even the open weight models that these guys have released? How often, just give us sort of both velocity, volume, and how you're sort of seeing that happen.
Sure. Yeah. I think that the first thing is exactly what you said, which is it used to be that you had to train a model before you could start to get any value out of it. And I think the large generative pre-trained transformer models really changed that on its head. You could prompt it and it'd start to give you responses back. We see a pretty defined trend, which is especially in the enterprise organizations, you first start just prompting the model and then you prompt engineer. You eventually hook up something for evals and evaluation so you can get a numeric sense of how those models are doing. And then it becomes very use case dependent. For some set of use cases, especially as organizations are trying out, especially let's say lower volume inference, if you're only running 1 query per second or below, you're generally okay pinging the foundation model directly, especially if you're getting the accuracy one. But then we see a set of users that need the next level of accuracy. They were able to get to 70 to 80% with prompt engineering, but they need 95% plus for where you need to be able to get. Or they need to do more with less. They want that, accuracy the large model can give you, but at a tenth of the latency or at a fraction of the cost, because the use case only really makes sense with those dynamics in place. That's where we see organizations start to fine tune, typically some of these smaller models and smaller open weight models, so that they can run really high volume inference at a much more cost effective, latency effective, or accuracy range. Now, fine tuning is still something that requires a lot of effort from organizations, in particular in doing the data prep side. And so it tends to be something, if you were asking me to approximate, I'd say probably 80% of use cases plus that I see people are rolling out with foundation models that aren't necessarily tuned. But for the really high value, really high volume use cases, that's where they end up starting to tune and go into more efficient models.
And if you were to just think of gut, finger in the air, what are the use cases? Are they still stuck in sort of chatbot land, or are you seeing real? Yeah, what are those? Sort of give us some.
Yeah, no, I think look, in 2023, when the LLM wave really hit, we spent a long time determining how we wanted to adapt our platform for training and serving deep learning models now to large language models. So we went on a lot of customer conversations and asked people their use cases. The first half of 2023, the most common use case I heard was, I don't know my use case, which building a startup in that environment can be a little bit stressful. But by the end of that year in 2024, a lot more use cases came out. And there were RAG plus chat, like retrieval augmented generation plus chatbot use cases.
Yep.
One way you can think about it is it was really search on steroids with my own corpus. Was really kind of where people were geared towards. I don't think that's where people are realizing the most value from generative AI today, though. I think the most value from generative AI comes when you start to plug in the models in something that's more of an automation-oriented use case, something where you take a menial repetitive task and you start to actually have the model be able to go run through that. So one of the examples of this is we worked with an organization that does background checks for employees all over. And so they used to go through documents and document processing, criminal record charges and others. You need to be able to extract out these fields. Exactly the type of thing that models are really good at: reading comprehension, extraction, and being able to operate on that. So they shifted those towards models that were tuned with Predibase. Another example are companies that need to be able to process call center and call center analytics, not just for being able to go and give you the suggested response, but how's the tone of this customer? There's 64 different indicators this company actually assesses. From tone, likely to follow up, or competitors mentioned, being able to pull all of that out. I think that better chat and better search are just the first things that come to mind, because that's really the modality we saw with ChatGPT. But when we think about enterprise ROI, I think there's two things that end up driving that. The first is more automation oriented. And then the second is hooking up these models to tools, which is really where I think the rise of agents and agentic AI is coming, so that it can do a lot more in terms of what it's actually interacting with.
Any examples that come to mind with, and I guess you obviously mentioned the examples for the background check piece, which was the automation thing, because I guess I'm curious about the agent use cases as well, because a lot of people still plug agent behind a chatbot and call it agentic as well. I'm assuming that's not the use case you're referring to.
I think that, at times it can be, but one of the best examples for agentic in a lot of organizations are these coding agents that I think are increasingly being deployed across organizations. So coding agents started off maybe similar to how we think about chat as autocomplete suggestions. But now coding agents generate unit and run unit testing. They can file PRs and pull requests. And we've seen instances where companies go pretty aggressive in the type of access that they give coding agents. But I think that's really one simple example. The brilliant thing about agents is I don't think it's a lot of the demos that we run through for agents have this one really impressive deep workflow. It's the agent's planning my entire wedding for me. But a lot of the things I actually see in the enterprise is something really bespoke and really bite-sized. I just want an agent to be able to do. One very simple example is every day I need to go and generate emails for the Salesforce opportunities that I have. I need to update my opportunities based on the call transcript, notes, and others. This is not a groundbreaking use case in terms of 20 different systems that need to get orchestrated, but it's maybe my Zoom transcripts and my Salesforce instances. I think that's like a great example of something where you need to give it access to a couple of tools. It needs to be able to read from one, write to another. And what I see rather than like one big agent as being successful is people really starting to hammer out across multiple of these.
And like if you were to get a sort of percentage in the way that you work with enterprises right now, I think you gave a little bit, like 80% are using foundational models. Maybe 20, is it sort of 20% are using these more fine-tuned open weight models? Or, and then when you say enterprise, are we thinking big Fortune 100 or like in the Fortune 5,000, right? Kind of.
Yeah. So Rubrik and our customer base, we really think about as being like global 2000 enterprise in a large way. And it tends to be, the folks that I've spent a lot of time with over the last 4 months tend to be both IT and security leaders across those organizations. Look, I think if we think about foundational model usage versus open source model usage, it's probably pretty still weighted towards foundation models by use case count. The big difference might come from that the really high volume use cases are the ones that are more likely to be, more that where there's more effort being put behind maybe tuning or otherwise. I think the other trend that I've noticed too is like where agents are starting to become a thing and what the trend there is. And I actually have a little bit of data on that, which is over the past 3 or 4 months, I've spoken to about 180 different organizations at like the IT and security level. And I broke down where were they in 4 different phases of agentic development. So phase 0 actually was we haven't started experimenting with agents. Phase 1 was experimentation. Phase 2 was what we called formalization, where they had started to roll out maybe their first, second, or third agent. They had gone from experimentation into just early stages of production. Phase 3 was scaling. Then phase 4 was autonomous AI, just sort of a catch-all for where we think the world is going to go, but not anyone's really there yet when it comes to G2K. And what we saw was about 12% of organizations that I spoke to of the 180, they said, we haven't even started. There's no agent projects going on internally. But the vast majority, 88%, had at least started. 52% were in experimentation. And I want to say about 22, 23% were in that formalization phase. So definitely a lot of heavy experimentation phase for the enterprise still right now in 2025.
You're talking to these leaders, you're sort of seeing this adoption in agents. Now you're talking to, like what you said, IT and security leaders. So, they're going to have a different perspective on this. What have you found to be some of their top areas of both things that maybe excite them, that scare them? How are they sort of reacting, and what's been their response to this AI movement?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing that's important is maybe let's just define agents for a moment. Then we can talk about what's exciting and what's scary. I define agents, and at Rubrik, we've been defining agents as just LLMs with access to tools. So we can think about that as models that can take action on behalf of the user or be able to interact with some of the enterprise applications and production systems. What excites them is oftentimes seeing some of the examples of like a use case, the productivity lift they've seen externally. So there's oftentimes a board level pressure that comes down based on what we've seen in the competitive landscape. Customer or company A is doing something, and that means company B, C, and D in that same space need to do the same or better in order to make sure that they don't get leapfrogged. So I think a lot of times it's coming from like this either board level dynamic or even what they see in terms of the demos that get built very quickly. Look, building an agent has never been easier. It takes days to be able to build an agent. It's like a prompt plus some tools. What scares people, I think, is that it only takes days to build an agent. And so, what
I would say hours even. But
hours, right? Exactly. Days probably to be conservative, right? And what scares people is it takes only hours or days to be able to build agents. And a lot of people can do it. People can do it quickly. And by the definition I gave you of agents, what we're talking about is giving non-deterministic models and LLMs access to enterprise IT and security tools that maybe it hasn't already been architected for. So the types of concerns that I hear, I broadly kind of bucket into 3 areas. The first is there's a concern around what I hear is like agent sprawl or, shadow AI now becoming shadow agents. It's this idea that is there like this second digital and AI workforce that's being developed inside of my organization that I don't have a really good handle of. I background check all my employees. I have management reports and others. But if anybody's building agents, I've spoken to a lot of organizations that said it took them a long time to get from 1 to 5 agents, but took them almost no time at all to get from 5 to 500. It's like once it starts, it can really become a snowball quickly. So the first concern I hear is, do I have a handle on what's actually even happening? Observability. Like, do I know what's happening on that side? The second concern I have that I hear often, and I think this is maybe one of the most nebulous, but every organization, it seems to me now, has an AI governance committee or body, really. And that committee is responsible for coming up with these policies around what AI or agents can and can't do. A good example is like a lot of organizations say agents should not give financial advice or should not make hiring or discrimination decisions. Sounds great. How do you actually enforce that in practice? Especially if people are building agents everywhere. I'll tell you what we did as a first stab. We had a committee meeting every few weeks that would review projects. And we had Google Forms that you'd go ahead and do and like attestations. It's like some small examples for how we were thinking through this. And I think what we saw and ran into is if you can build agents in hours, but the committee meetings are going to take weeks and the review process is there. And then it's only a one-time issue. Like, you've that it would like operated like this on July 26th, but who's to say what's happening on August 26th? That really, I think, felt uncompelling from like a real governance with teeth aspect. So that's the second bucket of issues that I've heard.
And it's an example of governance, safety, and security just getting in the way of progress.
I actually think about it a little bit more of like the problem of not having a technology solution for governance, security, and safety, and instead relying purely on people, process, and paper. Because what our engineers actually would tell you is we want the agents to do the right thing too. So we believe strongly in like the governance and security guardrails. What we don't want is to have to go and review this every 2 to 4 weeks in a committee meeting. Tell us the rules and the framework. Give us a way to be able to enforce those. And as long as we're operating in that, let us go.
Yeah.
Let's move. Exactly. And so it's really about like, I think about it as like transparency. Like, do you have a set of controls defined? And can you run those controls in a way that allow people to build and, have the confidence that things are going to actually work out in the way that we want them to? And then the third bucket, so the first bucket was observability. The second bucket was governance with enforcement, I think about. And then the third bucket is, look, something's going to go wrong. And I think Rubrik has had this mentality from early days called assume breach, which was to say we layer on a set of policies, a set of solutions to try and minimize the impact of anything that'll happen or minimize the likelihood that it will. But we all operate in the real world and things will go wrong. And I think realistic nature of agentic AI is it moves much more quickly than human threats. And so it's probably more likely as well that good things will happen much more quickly and the occasional bad things will also happen. And so you need some way to like undo or remediate where things go wrong. And those are the three key things that I think I've been really hearing from enterprise IT and security leaders.
I was going to say, is it possible to undo though?
Yeah, that's exactly like when you think about I am also a 1,000% assume breach.
Yeah. I think most cybersecurity,
in all of my organizations, that was my number one principle. But assuming breach is way easy to say, way more difficult to implement in any real world scenarios because it's very expensive actually when you think about assume breach. And so like I think Ashish, going to you, like take one of your examples, like, hey, AI should not be making decisions on human resources, resume acceptance or priority. And then you assume breach here, or in this instance, not necessarily breach, but assume bad intent or accidental intent has occurred. And AI has been put into a place where it now has been making decisions on resumes. How do you even implement or think about that kind of strategy planning?
Yeah, I think maybe just to jump in on this idea of like, is it even possible to, do that action? We actually first started to get more into this space when we had this idea that we called Agent Rewind. We released it, I think a few months ago was when we first started to talk about it externally. But the core idea was that Rubrik is backing up a lot of the most important production systems already for the Global 2000 enterprise customers that we work with. And we're constantly, on the policy level that's been set, taking the snapshots for like what are all the deltas and the diffs that are being made towards these production systems. And we need that for business continuity, but it can also be applied in a lot of settings for continuity in the case where an agent is taking an action. So to give you an example, one of the settings that I think became famous earlier this year is when a coding agent at one of the companies in the Valley, went rogue and deleted a production database. The fastest way to sub-optimize the routine is to be able to actually just delete that database entirely. Now, a lot of instances you kind of say, okay, the database is gone. What do I do here? The great thing I think we have with Rubrik is we actually have the previous healthy snapshots from before the agent took that action on, as an example, that database. And so what we've really paired is we paired a new feature that we released around agent observability that'll let us see when agents are taking certain actions. And we paired that with Rubrik's core understanding of the enterprise backup and data. And so we say that if an organization has an agent that's taken an inadvertent or maliciously destructive action, or just a delicious action on anything that Rubrik protects, we can actually allow you to one-click recover from that previous healthy snapshot and backup, which for a lot of instances that look like data mutations, deletions, edits, and others, essentially effectively look like a rewind for what that AI agent had done on that system. And so that, I think when we started to explain it that way, actually, the reaction I get from a lot of IT leaders is pretty similar, which is like, I didn't really think about these actions being reversible. And there's some class of actions that today I think aren't reversible, but a lot of the ones that I think are talking about editing production systems and others internally are ones that Rubrik has a pretty interesting ability to protect.
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, I really like that name, Agent Rewind. Yes, I would agree with this. Like, I can understand where database backup and recovery can play a lot in sort of the assume, damage sort of aspect of this. But a lot of agents are interacting in applications, changing configurations, changing SaaS applications or data and SaaS applications. And these aspects where, the power of an agent is the tools and interacting across all of these different applications. How do, there's configurations, there's workflows, there's SaaS applications that all get changed. I'm assuming, I don't want to make this too much of a Rubrik commercial, but like, is that then a problem that Rubrik or any other vendor can then say, oh, restore, right? That seems to be a very challenging area.
Yeah, I will say, not to make it a Rubrik commercial, but of everyone, when I speak with folks, I haven't seen anybody else talk about these AI agent rewind capabilities. So as far as I'm aware, I think we're the folks that are really leading in this space. To your point, are there SaaS applications and others also capable for it? Yes. Actually, Rubrik protects and backs up SaaS applications like Salesforce as an instance. So we're talking about, the edit that shouldn't have happened. That's just one example. That's a type of property that Rubrik is actually protecting as well. I think in large part, what we see is actions can exist, not just in the database side, but like configurations, which oftentimes are actually backed up as well, SaaS applications as well. And then there's a class of other things, which are transactions, which are not so much necessarily like it's like actual, money left in a bank account or something along those lines, which aren't quite as relevant in the backup space. Those are ones that we have some early thinking on that, are a little bit adjacent towards backup. But a lot of what I think organizations and agents are operating on right now already sort of fall in the purview of what we think about being important for business continuity.
Okay, so moving forward on the agentic AI sort of side of things, we're starting to see a lot of really interesting applications come out with AI, like some really powerful things that are now, all these vendors are now like, they're starting to come out of the woodwork with AI behind them. But when we talk to enterprises, like the core enterprises that are doing these things, minus vendors, I still get a pretty cold amount of feet of people saying real production AI is actually running and doing things and serving their customers, minus your chatbot customer service sort of model or NLP play. Like what? And I know we talked a lot about this at the beginning, but I want to continue to put pressure here and find more info from you as to maybe why, or are you seeing that same thing? And what's, do you have any predictions around this?
Totally. Yeah. I do. And I also have a prediction around it. I think that realistically, a lot of agents today, in fact, let me just say almost all agents across the enterprise are in read mode, right? They're agents that like essentially can maybe help me access a little bit of information. But a lot of the interesting use cases we often talk about, which is like, go get this information from here, right in this production system, or, be able to take this action on my behalf, are currently being blocked because organizations have these policies that say the agents should be read-only. And to get write access, it's actually quite a bit of a leap inside of a lot of the companies. Because think about it, you want to give a non-deterministic model with a non-human identity write access to my system.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no trust. And I think trust really will come down in two ways. I don't think we necessarily have to put the trust in the agent itself. It's hard. It's a model that is a little bit difficult to explain and otherwise. We need to have trust in the controls that exist across these agents. One thing I saw is that in 2025 and maybe part of 24, a lot of people predicted this future of agentic AI, and a lot of platforms came out that make it easy to build agents, no code, low code, pro code, everything in between, to do open source orchestration of agents. But that's not really the concern I hear from organizations today. It's not like I need another orchestration framework or I need another, low code agent builder. The concern I have is these agents are getting built all over the place. How do I actually have active real-time enforcement of guardrails that I want? And what do I do if something goes wrong? So those two factors, I think, haven't really hit the market in terms of I'm curious to hear as well from listeners. Otherwise, if anyone's found vendors that have solved this trust problem for them when
I
it comes
have
to
3,000 startups in stealth mode right now that I have been pitched.
That's right.
Are all trying to solve that trust barrier, which I can go on a rant on that a little bit later, but maybe we'll get to that in this call.
And the truth is, it's hard for the Global 2000 enterprise. I mean, look, as a startup that sold to some of the Global 2000 enterprise, it's hard, right? And as small seed stage stealth mode startup to be able to actually be trusted with the enterprise IT and security applications inside the whole system. And I think that until there's a real platform that works that's enterprise grade, we're going to continue to be in read mode. And as long as we're in read mode, we're going to continue to get these questions on the ROI of AI of are agents actually doing anything cool or interesting? Because read mode agents tend to be something that's better search, better knowledge retrieval. And that is valuable, but a lot of the types of use cases that I think we all talk about and get excited about, when you hear an exec talk about 2 to 3x productivity improvements, it's not going to come from slightly better Google search internally.
Yeah.
And so we need to think about what are the controls organizations need before they're comfortable going from read to write.
It's like the difference between an AI reading my code and telling me what it's about versus writing code and building something.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd say there's an order of magnitude, or at least a factor, maybe an order of magnitude difference in the productivity gains that I get from reading its assessment versus just do it for me.
So then what do you what is your prediction? How do you think this problem will be solved? I've got a lot of, and I'll give you some background. I get a lot of these startups that will come and pitch, yes, we need the control place and authorization and authentication of agents. And then when you ask, well, how do you determine whether an agent is doing a good or bad thing? Every single one of these guys all comes down to, oh, we'll just do some sort of anomalous behavior analysis, which is complete failure right from the start.
Right.
And no one seems to really understand what it is or what it even means to be able to say, how do you put the right controls around an agent to go and do stuff? What do you think? How do you think this is going to be solved?
I have a pretty specific thought on how I think it'll likely get solved. And, the first thing I'll just say before I go too into the weeds on the tech behind it is, I think there are 2 pillars that you're going to need before you get comfortable from a control standpoint. The first is you're going to want to be able to do something proactively. So understand preventative tools that you can put in. And then the second is I think you're going to need a remediation layer. Again, the assume breach mentality. I don't think people will give
right solution. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. The Rubrik solution, because I don't think people will give write access. Even if you tell me I have some controls in place, if you tell me that the entire business is sunk, if the agent makes the wrong mistake, it's just really too early to know all the different ways agents can operate. But we've talked about rewind, which is how do I get a control when something goes wrong? Let me tell you about how I think about these actual controls and governance. I think anomaly detection it's useful in the sense there's this behavioral and analytics previous era that happened with cloud security too, in terms of where configurations and other can go wrong. But it's oftentimes attacking the problem a little bit too late. And it's also not even high recall enough in terms of the types of things that can go wrong.
And I'll tell you, just in my experience, in going through in any decent enterprise, I used to think that before being in an enterprise. And then now I don't think there is such a thing as normal.
Yes.
I don't think there is a normal baseline in any enterprise.
Perfect.
That's been
I completely agree with that. I don't think there's a normal baseline. And I think where a lot of the tools fail today, these guardrail tools that provide you the ability to, say, oh, the AI won't hallucinate or something along those lines, is they take this one size fits all solution, the single guardrail, and they're every organization will want this. The reality of what I see is every organization has its own quite bespoke policies that they actually need to be able to enforce on what it means for an agent to be able to go wrong. So we gave that HR discrimination example. I spoke with the company in the housing space that talked about how, what an agent says with respect to housing and demographics around housing or neighborhoods is also really sensitive. There is no human way I can think about encoding that into a rule. Like, I cannot imagine like putting a rule in place that says, do not, talk about these demographic categories of classes. There's so many ways to express things in English language that I think the only way that organizations are going to be able to get comfortable or be able to do this is you're going to need AI systems and models to be able to actually enforce these policies themselves. Because these policies are written up by legal or infosec in English, and you need to be able to do real-time enforcement around that.
Yeah.
Now, actually, these models are relatively good at being discriminators. And what I mean by that is like looking at an input or an output and then judging, yeah, this looks okay, or no, this doesn't look okay. If you give it some text and ask it, does it adhere to this? Models are pretty good at that type of simple decision making. The trick that you're going to run into is every time I make a LLM call, it's going to get really expensive if I have to make like 3 or 4 or 10 other LLM calls as well that say something like, hey, is it violating this policy or others? And so what I think you're going to need is a series of a system where you can define a policy in natural language. That policy essentially gets distilled into a small language model itself that can run at low latency. I'm talking an order of magnitude lower than what a system could do. And also where you can multiplex all of these small language models to operate off the same model. So it's not like you need 80 different models. You're actually running 80 indicators on top of the same model.
Yep.
We had not thought about this use case, but we open sourced some of the underlying infrastructure to make something like that possible. The open source project is called Lorax, like the Dr. Seuss character, and there's some ML terminology puns for why that is.
Oh.
But that really, I think, is forming the basis for how our take on the solution is. We think AI is going to have to protect some of these AI situations because it's too nuanced to leave to rule systems or otherwise, or to anomaly detection.
Yeah, so if I were to sort of say it in a simplistic way, it's building a system of AI judges or cops that will monitor all of the different calls at wherever AI is being used and can infer a set of policies and behavior and ensure that when those infractions occur, alerts will be sent or restrictions can be applied.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that last piece is critical, which is some of these, and we've just started to speak with some of our early customers about this as well. So I think people are getting a sneak peek to some of the conversations we've been having. But some of these operate in an alert mode. They're monitoring, great. A lot of them need to operate inline in a block mode. They need to say, if you're doing this, drop the request. And that's really where some of the technical challenges around latency and others, where you make sure that this isn't adding overhead in a synchronous call, come up.
Yep. So is the future then a lot of SLMs, for lack of a better word, that are making that call so that it's a cost-effective exercise to let that LLM be the judge? And do you see that across? I guess there are 2 layers to this, because the audience is from security. They're obviously thinking in their head, am I building SLM for my team or so I guess it's worthwhile calling out. A business may have, I think this is how I hear this, and correct me if I'm wrong. It's, as a business, I have a public facing, let's just say in this particular case, chatbot or housing or whatever you're going to use. I have designed a bunch of SLMs to make that judgment call for, is this right? And whether it's inline or on the host or whatever the thing may be, that's more of my business. Alerts comes out of it and goes to security and or whoever it needs to go to, developer, wherever, they triage and they do what the regular program is. Or do you see there's capabilities like these coming up there as well in those smaller teams?
So we went pretty in the weeds on like what the solution could look like in terms of like small language models, multiplexing and others. But having worked as a company that helped organizations build SLMs, there's no chance that I'd want to say every business and security leader needs to build these. I think from a business standpoint, what it's going to look like is you just are able to define the policies you need in natural language at the level of detail that you want. And then you can set that to be in a monitor or block mode. That's what I think, from the business side, that's all you need. The fact that it's using SLMs and that they're multiplexing, that's all under the hood from an implementation side.
So let me ask you, Dev, like there are a lot, what you're explaining is effectively LLM firewalls, right? And there are a lot of them. Like there are a lot of these sort of prompt guards, LLM firewall types of solutions in the market. And you haven't seen a lot of at least pickup, at least that's been my experience, right? You don't see a lot of pickup of these things. And yet that really is, to some extent, what you're talking about. Like, help me understand sort of the
Partially.
dynamics here.
I actually think so. LLM firewalls often operate at like a network level. And the use cases LLM firewalls I think have been being applied to tend to be like shadow AI discovery. And then also like these relatively, let's say, generalized detections. What I mean by that is like these generalized detections are things like, hey, is PII leaving my system? That's
Or are
like the
you
most
trying to
common.
prompt inject?
Or are
And
you trying to do a prompt injection attack? There's like 6, 8, or 10 of these indicators that have become pretty popular. And like these firewalls are all looking to be able to enforce that. But I think I really liked what you said earlier, which is like there's nothing general about like what happens inside of an enterprise. There's not that, right? These systems, I think, work well for like that very first open-ended use case that gets someone comfortable using ChatGPT, which is like, okay, I know that there's an LLM firewall. They'll make sure I don't send PII to ChatGPT or that someone doesn't try to jailbreak ChatGPT. But I think what we're talking about is the actual ability to define your own policies and in natural language as well that can go run and be able to do violations or blocking. Now, the violations and blocking is a capability firewalls have had, but the ability to actually define your own policies in natural language that say something like, hey, my agent should not be able to provide discriminatory housing information. Like that's actually a very bespoke thing. Those are capabilities that I haven't seen really kind of within the LLM firewall.
so Dev, let me ask you, do you think that is just a prompt or that is a fine-tuned kind of
SLM.
feature that has to be done?
I think it's a workflow, and I think it's a workflow that's going to incorporate a few. Or we should show you the product demo at some point. Primitives, I think there's a prompt, but it's not just a simple prompt. There's actually there's these cookbooks that have been published by some of the leading labs around how they developed their own guardrail models, which operate intrinsic to the model. We'd be applying extrinsic, but like they apply intrinsic. What are the types of information you need to be able to provide? That oftentimes includes like a prompt, an example of like an example, an explanation field. So it's a structured prompt. This might be the first thing I'll say. Yep. But then it goes beyond that. It also needs to be able to take feedback in from a user or a system as well. And that's where things go into a workflow side. And then there's something proprietary about how you actually fine tune that. The real purpose of fine tuning is twofold. The first, to be able to incorporate some of that feedback. But then the second is to get that small footprint where you're not going to add, 100% of network latency overhead in order to be able to run this system. You're going to add something very small. So that's how I think about it.
Okay, so maybe two things. First, tell me if I'm correct in this, is what you're saying is there's almost the process that you're talking about is almost a fine tuning of the prompt itself as it learns and gets the feedback required for that business context, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And there is a additional piece around fine tuning that you'll do because this prompt might work great on a large model, but once you actually deploy it into production, this is the classic example where we'll need a really low latency small model. So we'll need to fine tune a little bit to be able to distill into a small model that can run as a guard.
And then how do you deal with where does it get placed? So what you're saying is, okay, let's get this sort of workflow of consistently fine tuning the prompt for a very small, fast, cheap model to be able to do the judging. Where do you put it? Do you still put it in a network man in the middle kind of place? Where does it sit in this scenario?
Most organizations that we're working with today have some centralization towards like how something like AI API keys get distributed. Like call that a gateway solution or something similar. We think that there's a few different places where this ends up getting put, but one of the most common initial starting places is you have a central system that's like distributing keys, and that's like oftentimes routing. It's like a gateway / router. It routes towards like Anthropic, OpenAI, or anywhere else that you want to do it. We attach to that or act as your standalone gateway if you don't have one already. Yeah. So that's where you put that solution.
It's like an open router for the enterprise.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Out of curiosity, because this is something that, funny enough, I was at AWS and a lot of the conversation that I had at reInvent was around this very problem of being able to not have this, for lack of a better word, deviant from, hey, I am an insurance company, I should not be giving financial advice.
Right.
Because you come from that deep learning space from before. Was this a problem then, or is this a newer problem? Because now we are more in production where the deep learning was, hey, I need to pump up this, like start the system, run for 5 minutes, and hopefully we fed the answer. What was the difference? Why is it a problem now, or was it already solved before and now we're just It's another way of the same problem, I guess.
So in DL, we had like two sets of challenges. We had one that was like considered in compliance broadly. One of them was drift detection. We always talked about, hey, you're getting new data. Does the model still work? That was more of a performance-oriented challenge. And then you had a second challenge, which was like model bias. But the big difference was that in deep learning, we never really gave those models access to tools. They were like statistical models, essentially, that were able to go ahead and operate within some very confined setting. Like you took the output, like you took the Zillow estimate as an example, and you plugged it into some product or feature. Now, I think the biggest thing that's happening is we're thinking about actually enabling these models to have access to tools. And, coming back to the original question, I think also Caleb was asking, it's like people are doing all these cool agent demos, but then you talk to the enterprise and is it real there? No, it's not. Why not? Well, they're still in read mode. They're not in write mode. What's stopping them from going to write mode? These sets of guards. These previous deep learning model instantiations never went into write mode. They never had to go really into write mode. And so bias was a thing, and we have some learnings from that. But this level of autonomous guardrailing, I think, is different. The second really quick thing is deep learning models were almost exclusively built by PhDs and multi-function teams. Pretty much always took several months. Agents are being built by anybody vibe coding and takes hours. And so the scale of problem we're talking about is also different.
Someone just made one as he or she heard the episode, I guess, I imagine. So they're like, let me just vibe code this.
Yeah.
Well, what other burning questions or burning things that are on your mind that you'd love to be able to get people to know and realize?
I think that if I had to summarize a couple of my thoughts, one of them is agents are going to inevitably graduate from read to write, because I think what's going to happen is people are going to be on some part of the risk curve, and the productivity gains are going to be realized by the folks that allow more autonomous action. I think one thing that I want people to know is undo is possible. We talked about that. I think another thing that I want people to know is that the current way that a lot of times governance policies are enforced is really painful, and I don't think actually will work as the system through the end of 2026. So there will be a vendor that is going to solve that problem. Obviously, I hope it's us, but somebody is going to solve that problem. And I think the way it's going to get solved is the way that we talked about in the architecture. And then the third thing that I want to talk about is just something in the back of people's minds is I think as people start to roll this out, there's going to be a class of tooling that we haven't even talked about yet that's going to be really interesting. That I've started to hear a little bit about people talk about this idea of digital twin in the enterprise and how agents interact with systems that are more simulated in nature. So I think there's some learnings we can pull from the autonomous vehicle space and others about what agents in the enterprise might even look like. But we're still on day zero problems today. How do we make sure something's secure enough to go from read to write? And I think that's where a lot of 26 will be focused.
Okay. And then my understanding is in order to do that, you need recovery and the ability to be able to do that. And then also the right guardrails in place, which you're hoping Lorax is sort of that foundation.
I think you need three things in total. The first is you need observability. You need something that's going to hook into where all your agents are and provide, what we call an auto discovered agent inventory. Then you take that observability and you plug in actual real-time enforcement of policies in that observability layer. That's how we call our governance pillar. And Lorax is, an open source piece of technology that we open sourced in 23, but it's one of the many pieces of tech that we will loop into that infrastructure. And then when, that's working, hopefully the vast majority of things are totally fine, but everything goes wrong, then you need recovery. So those three pillars are what I think about: observability, governance, remediation. And that's really the product that post-acquisition we announced called the Rubrik Agent Cloud.
Out of curiosity, you didn't mention identity because to what Caleb was saying, there's a huge wave of LLM firewalls, but there's also this NHI space, which is non-human identity, just also quite top of mind for a lot of people. I'm curious I guess what you've called out, I think those are really good examples, like the observable TPs, being able to rewind. I love those. I think where people may also be interested in is that some of the foundational things that they can apply, maybe. Is identity still playing a role here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's actually a good example of one of the primitives that I think there's two parts towards identity. There's management around agentic identity. So agentic identities need to get minted. They need to be credentialed and scoped. They need to be associated with the agents. And a lot of the underlying identity providers are actually tackling these sides of the problems. Things like Okta or Entra inside of Microsoft, as they were talking about Ignite. And then there's a second layer, which I think actually extends more towards observability and enforcement, but when it comes towards identities. When it comes towards agents, you need to know what agents are running, but you also need to know the number one question I often get is what agents are running. Number two is what tools and data do they have access to? Well, the tools and data they have access to are fundamentally correlated towards what identity credentials are they actually using and what are the scopes on that. And so that actually we bucket, that identity management piece we think is going to be well handled by that underlying identity provider substrate. And there's probably going to be a lot of companies that make a lot of money even in that space. But I think then there's going to be that second piece of like identity observability and governance. And both of those we think fit into that same agent platform.
Oh, right. Okay. Because I was going to say, how do you even, is this where the MCP and A2A world that kind of opened up for everyone? I don't know how many MCPs are running at any given point in time in my organization.
Well, I think the biggest actual security consideration for MCP tends to be around like governance and security. How do I know if it's a registered MCP server? How do I know if like it's something that actually can use the secure credentials? So my take is people are very excited. I spoke to a CISO who was like, I'm very excited about MCP. I cannot wait until I can actually start to use it, but there's no way I can use it today. And so I think I see, again, a number of startups that are operating in this space as well, but come back to some of the same concerns.
I have maybe one final question for you, since we're on the MCP topic. MCP or A2A?
Oh, who's going to win? Who's going to win?
It's a good question. And I mean, I think that you could probably see these acting somewhat harmoniously. So I think maybe set up to tackle separate problems. I'll try and answer it, quickly as well towards the end. But MCP, I think about as being able to tackle the problem of how do I APFI production applications everywhere that agents can start to go and access. And then A2A, agent protocol, I think for the idea that agents are not just going to be interacting only with production systems, but directly also with other agents. And we need a way to be able to support that. I think MCP will get traction first. And I think one of the reasons is like there's like a really core set of concerns that MCP starts to be able to address that aren't super futuristic, but are banal to some extent, like things that we just need here and now. And I think the main thing that's actually just inhibiting MCP today is I think a really good security and governance framework around it.
But
I was at
has all of that. And then so why is it not getting? It has the identity, authentication, all of the right security primitives to make it a very enterprise deployable solution. Why do you think that has not gathered steam?
I think that it actually comes a little bit down to the underlying identity systems themselves. I think the underlying identity systems, and this is a flaw for both MCP and A2A, but like if we're saying A2A has the right like security posture, I think one of the issues is that the underlying identity systems that A2A or MCP inherit don't have the level of granularity that I think a lot of times organizations want for the agentic applications they're going to deliver. As one example, like a lot of these systems might use like OAuth tokens as like their underlying credential, like a service account or an OAuth token, maybe that's been delegated from a user in order to be able to do it. That OAuth token might say something like, oh, you can send emails. Or like that's the level of scopes, right? On it, it's like you can send emails, you can read emails or so forth. Yeah. But what we talk about with agents is like, yes, you can send emails, but you can't send any emails that, maybe you can send emails to internal recipients, but not external recipients or something along those lines. You actually want like a more granular level of control that exists. And I think that's one of the issues that probably both of the protocols, I don't think it necessarily gets fixed in the protocols themselves. I think it gets fixed maybe in some of the scaffolding that gets built around these. Well, I'm curious what your take is though, Caleb.
Yeah, just for audience, A2A has solved that. It allows you to define custom scopes that allow you to get more fine-grained control. And the way that they've set everything up in there is extremely strong. Like, actually, to me, first of all, Dev, I agree with you. I mean, MCP is going to win. But the reason why it's going to win is because Google is terrible at marketing. And that to me has been the struggle, because like A2A, for all intents and purposes, for an enterprise is almost a no-brainer. It seems to me when you look through and use A2A, if I'm going to deploy agents in production, this is what I use, right? MCP is a good IT tool that I screw around with, but like you look at A2A and you're like, okay, this is like engineering quality, prod scalability, and it's got the security features that you need. It's just no one knows about it. That's what I think is it's just a Google marketing usability problem.
Do you think it's just marketing? Actually, I feel like I hear more. I mean, it's not at the same level of name recognition as MCP, definitely. But I think if it's just a marketing concern, look, I worked at Google for a while, and I understand what you're saying. I think we'll get over that through the end of 2026. If you told me that people spent similar marketing dollars, but I think it's a really interesting race to see who will win. Because I think maybe we're both backing the same horse, slightly different reasons.
I don't know, guys. I'm just backing the A2 Wave more, not the MCP one. I think we spoke about this for a long time, but I know we're on time as well. I think we should do a part 2, but hey, because there's so much more to unpack here. Where can people get in touch with you, Dev, to talk more about all of this and the stuff that Rubrik is doing?
Yeah, definitely. If you go to the Rubrik.com website, there's actually a page on the Rubrik Agent Cloud. You'll be able to see what we're doing. We are putting out like demo videos and others, so you can actually see a little bit of what this product look like. And then if you want to just reach out to me too, I'm Dev Rishi, and more than happy to chat a little bit more about any of these topics. It's something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about.
All right, I'll put your LinkedIn in there as well. I'm assuming that's the socials for you.
Yeah, LinkedIn is perfect.
Awesome. All right, dude. Thanks so much for this and for tuning in and being such an insightful conversation. I had so much I had to take so many notes on this, at least mental notes. But thank you so much for doing this. And thanks everyone for tuning in as well. Looking forward to part 2, hopefully. Thank you for watching or listening to that episode of AI Security Podcast. This was brought to you by TechRiot.io. If you want to hear or watch more episodes of AI Security, check that out on AISecurityPodcast.com. And in case you're interested in learning more about cloud security, you should check out a sister podcast called Cloud Security Podcast, which is available on cloudsecuritypodcast.tv. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode. Peace.